Clear the entrance. The sharp command from the vanguard cut through the bustling Seoul night like a blade. Dae-pyo's jaw was tight, his obsidian eyes, framed by a faint, jagged scar resting high on his cheekbone, didn't blink once as his men moved in. They stepped forward in unison, sharp black suits carting a path through the crowded sidewalk, shoving the hopeful patrons of the city's most exclusive venue aside. It was always the same. Everywhere he went, the sea of humanity parted for him. Whether it was rival syndicate bosses begging for mercy, terrified politicians offering favors, or desperate socialites trying to catch his eye, they all scrambled out of his way with the same manufactured respect. They yielded out of fear, wrapping their terror in polite bows and trembling hands. Fake authority, fake deference, fake everything. He adjusted the lapel of his tailored black overcoat, burying his hands in his pockets as he walked straight toward the golden velvet rope of the VIP entrance. The neon glow of the city reflected off the glass doors, but Dae-pyo felt nothing. He hadn't felt challenged or even interested in a decade. "The owner cleared the main table for you, boss," Min-soo, his right-hand man, said, stepping forward to unhook the VIP barrier. Min-soo had dismantled entire rival gangs for the empire. He knew exactly how to pave the way. Dae-pyo didn't even slow his stride. But before Min-soo could touch the brass clasp, a slender hand shot out, palm flat, dead center in Dae-pyo's path. "Step back." The voice didn't shake. It didn't tremble. It was absolute. Dae-pyo finally stopped. His cold gaze dropped to the VIP clipboard tucked under her arm, then traveled slowly up the sharp lines of her tailored black suit, resting on her face. Her dark hair was pulled into a flawless, high-textured bun. Her chin was tilted up, and her eyes met his without a single flicker of fear. "I don't care who you are," Naevia said, her tone as solid as the steel stanchions beside her. "This is the VIP line, and there are 12 guests ahead of you. Get in the back or get off my pavement." Min-soo gasped, his hand instinctively dropping toward the inside of his jacket. The entire street seemed to hold its breath. But Dae-pyo held up 2 fingers, silencing his men instantly. He looked at her raised hand, then back at her fierce, unyielding expression. The undisputed king of Seoul's underworld had never been told to wait. And for the first time in 10 years, he wanted to see exactly what would happen next. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Min-soo's hand remained perfectly still inside his coat, his eyes darting between his boss and the woman who had just signed her own death warrant. The street patrons, previously murmuring in excitement, were now completely frozen, practically trying to meld into the brick walls to escape the inevitable bloodshed. Naevia didn't lower her hand. Her dark eyes remained locked at Dae-pyo's, the ambient neon catching the stubborn set of her jaw. She was waiting for him to move. Dae-pyo let out a slow, quiet exhale that plumed in the crisp night air. He didn't shout, he didn't signal for his men to clear the obstacle. Instead, he took a deliberate step backward. The scuff of his polished leather shoe against the concrete was the only sound on the block. Then he took another step. He bypassed the golden stanchion, navigating around the stunned couple at the front of the queue, and walked all the way to the back. He stopped behind a trembling group of executives, folded his hands neatly in front of him, and waited. "Boss?" Min-soo choked out, finally breaking the silence. He looked completely unmoored, as if gravity had suddenly reversed. The rest of the vanguard shifted uneasily, exchanging panicked glances. They were trained for assassinations, hostile takeovers, and turf wars. They had no protocol for queuing. "Stand down," Dae-pyo murmured, his voice a low, even rumble that carried effortlessly. "We wait." Min-soo swallowed hard, stepping into line behind him. The sight was absurd, a wall of deadly black-suited muscles standing stiffly behind a group of terrified clubgoers. The executives in front of Dae-pyo looked like they were going to be sick, their hushed, frantic whispers betraying their panic as they realized exactly whose shadow they were standing in. At the front, Naevia finally lowered her hand. She gave Dae-pyo one last calculating look, a brief flash of surprise quickly masked by professional indifference, before turning her attention back to her clipboard. "Next," she called out, her voice steady. 40 minutes. That was how long Dae-pyo stood on the pavement. The cold bit into his face, but he hardly registered it. He simply watched her work. He watched how she handled the drunk, the entitled, the impatient, always with that same unyielding iron spine. No one intimidated her. No one bypassed her authority. He had built an empire by breaking people until they bowed. Yet here she stood, a gatekeeper with nothing but a clipboard and a sharp suit, commanding a line he was willingly standing in. The outrage he expected to feel never materialized. Instead, a foreign, dangerous curiosity began to root in his chest. As the line slowly inched forward, the undisputed king of Seoul's underworld realized he wasn't just waiting for entry to the club, he was waiting for her to look at him again. The ink on the acquisition contract was barely dry. It had taken Dae-pyo's lawyers exactly 3 hours to coerce the previous owner into selling the entire commercial block, including the exclusive venue Naevia guarded. To Dae-pyo, it was a simple transaction, a calculated move to eliminate the velvet rope and the long, grueling hours she spent standing in the biting chill. He didn't just want to clear her path, he intended to pave it in gold and hand her the deed. When he returned to the club the following evening, the neon lights were just flickering to life against the twilight. Naevia was already at her station, adjusting the collar of her immaculate black suit, preparing her clipboard for another relentless night of managing the city's entitled elite. Dae-pyo approached without his usual vanguard. He stopped directly in front of her podium, the faint scar on his cheek catching the glow of the street lamps. He didn't offer a greeting. Instead, he slid a heavy leather-bound folder across the sleek black surface of her stand. "You don't have to stand outside anymore," he said, his voice a smooth, low register that commanded the quiet street. "The venue is yours. The entire staff reports to you now. You can fire the manager who made you work the double shift yesterday." Naevia looked from the folder to his face, her expression entirely unreadable. She didn't eagerly tear it open. She didn't gasp at the staggering amount of money, power, and leverage casually laid before her. Slowly, deliberately, she flipped the leather cover back. Her dark eyes scanned the dense legal jargon, the transfer of ownership, and his stark, commanding signature at the bottom. The silence between them stretched, pulling taut like a wire. Dae-pyo waited for the gratitude, the awe, the sudden intoxicating realization of what it meant to be elevated by his hand. It was how his world functioned. Everyone had a price. Every problem could be suffocated with enough cash. Naevia picked up the thick stack of papers. Then, with a sharp flick of her wrist, she threw them directly at his chest. The crisp white pages erupted between them like a sudden snowstorm, glancing off his tailored lapels and fluttering down to rest on the dirty concrete. Dae-pyo froze, his eyes widening by a fraction of an inch. No one threw things at him. No one rejected his terms. "I am giving you control," he stated, genuine confusion warring with a sudden dark thrill. "You're giving me a cage with a nicer view," she fired back, leaning over the podium. Her eyes blazed with a fierce, untouchable pride that made his chest ache. "I earn what I have. I don't take handouts from men who think the world is a vending machine. Now pick up your trash and step aside. We open in 10 minutes. The rejection stung, but it was the mystery of her that drove him into the damp, unforgiving streets of the lower district at 3 in the morning. Dae-pyo sat in the back of his idling sedan, the tinted windows hiding his presence as he watched Naevia trudge up the cracked concrete steps of a decaying apartment complex. The sharp, unyielding gatekeeper from the VIP entrance was gone. In her place was an exhausted young woman, her shoulders slumped under the weight of an invisible burden. He hadn't sent his men to investigate, he needed to see this himself. Before she could reach her door, two men stepped out from the shadows of the stairwell. Dae-pyo's eyes narrowed, his hand instinctively moving toward the door handle. They were cheap muscle, low-level loan sharks, the kind of bottom feeders that infested the city's desperate edges. Naevia didn't scream, she didn't flinch. She simply reached into her coat and pulled out a thin envelope, handing it over. "This is short, Naevia," the taller thug sneered, slapping the envelope against his palm. "The interest compounded yesterday." "That's all I made in tips." Her voice drifted down to the street, stripped of her usual armor, raw and bone-tired. "I'll have the rest by Friday. Don't wake her up, please." The thug laughed, a cruel scraping sound, and leaned in. "Friday, or we take the medical equipment." Dae-pyo's grip on the door handle was white-knuckled. He could end them in 3 seconds. He could erase the debt with a single phone call. But as the thugs shoved past her and vanished into the night, the memory of the thrown contract burned in his mind. She didn't want a savior. Naevia leaned against her door for a long, fractured moment, her head bowed in the dim yellow light of the hallway. Then she took a shuddering breath, straightened her spine, and pushed inside. Through the thin ground-floor window, Dae-pyo watched the stark reality of her life unfold. He saw her kneel beside a small cot, her gentle hands adjusting a blanket over a frail figure, hooked to a softly hissing oxygen concentrator. He watched her press her forehead to the older woman's frail hand, her shoulders shaking in silent, hidden grief. It hit him then, a heavy, suffocating realization that made his immense wealth feel utterly hollow. The cage she had spoken of wasn't just a metaphor. She was trapped in a grinding cycle of debt and illness, fighting a desperate war for the only family she had left. She hadn't rejected his millions out of arrogance. She had rejected them because she knew that men who dealt in favors always came to collect. Dae-pyo leaned back into the leather seat, the shadows of the car swallowing him whole. He had intended to buy her world. Now he realized he had no idea what it actually cost to live in it. The whisper moved through the underworld like a plague. The king of Seoul had found a weakness. It took less than 48 hours for rival scouts to trace Dae-pyo's midnight detour back to the crumbling apartment complex in the lower district. When Min-soo laid the intel on his heavy mahogany desk, grainy photographs of hostile runners circling Naevia's block, he expected his boss to authorize a bloodbath. He expected a deployment of 50 armed guards to lock down the perimeter and turn the girl's street into a fortress. Dae-pyo didn't even pick up his pen. He ordered, "Stand down," his voice cold and absolute. "Send no one." Min-soo hesitated, genuine alarm written across his face. "Boss, if they get to her, they won't." Dae-pyo knew the fragile, iron-willed woman tending to a dying grandmother wouldn't survive being caged by his soldiers. A heavily armed mobster perimeter would draw the very police and landlord attention she was desperate to avoid, and she would despise him for turning her quiet misery into a war zone. She didn't want his money. She didn't want his empire. So he gave her the only thing he had left, himself. At 3 in the morning, the temperature plummeted, turning the city's breath into sharp, freezing fog. The alleyway directly across from Naevia's apartment was pitch black, smelling of damp concrete and forgotten trash. Dae-pyo stood perfectly still in the shadows, his hands shoved deep into his dark cashmere overcoat. He was entirely alone, no earpiece, no vanguard, just the undisputed ruler of the city's underbelly standing on frozen asphalt. When two rival enforcers finally rounded the corner, their hands hovering confidently near their waistbands, they stopped dead. They expected easy prey, an undefended girl they could snatch and use as leverage. Instead, they found a nightmare. Dae-pyo didn't draw a weapon. He simply stepped forward, letting the flickering, jaundiced glow of the streetlight catch the jagged scar on his cheek and the lethal, empty calm in his obsidian eyes. He didn't say a single word. He didn't have to. The sheer, suffocating terror of finding the king waiting for them in the dark, unguarded and unafraid, was enough. The enforcers backed away slowly, their faces drained of color, before turning and fleeing into the night. An hour later, the heavy metal door of the apartment groaned open. Naevia stepped out into the biting cold, pulling her thin, worn coat tight around her shoulders for the early morning shift. She paused at the bottom of the concrete steps, her breath catching as she spotted him across the narrow street. He didn't cross the asphalt. He didn't offer her a contract or cash or a grand proclamation of protection. He just held her gaze through the mist, a silent, unyielding barrier between her and the monsters of his world. Naevia's grip on her bag tightened. For a long, fractured moment, the unyielding armor in her eyes finally softened. She gave him a single, barely perceptible nod, turning toward the subway, leaving the king to guard her shadow. The dawn air was unforgiving, settling over the city in a damp, freezing haze. Dae-pyo hadn't moved from his post. He'd watched the sun bleed into the smoggy horizon, waiting until the familiar silhouette of Naevia emerged from the subway station after her night shift. This time, she didn't just offer a silent nod. She crossed the cracked asphalt, her footsteps quiet against the sleeping city, and stopped directly in front of him. Up close, the dark circles under her eyes were heavier, her skin pale from bone-deep exhaustion. She didn't look at his tailored overcoat or the expensive watch resting against his wrist. "There's a tent 2 blocks down," she said, her voice raspy from the cold. "They serve hot broth. Come on." She didn't wait for his answer. She just turned and walked. For a man who dictated the movements of thousands, following her into a cramped, plastic-wrapped pojangmatcha felt terrifyingly natural. The street stalls smelled of anchovy and scallions. There were no vanguards to sweep the room, no maitre d' bowing in manufactured terror. They sat on flimsy plastic stools that groaned under Dae-pyo's weight, a roaring propane heater fighting the bitter chill. Naevia ordered 2 bowls and paid the elderly vendor with a few crumpled, faded bills. When Dae-pyo instinctively reached inside his coat for his money clip, her hand shot out. Her fingers wrapped lightly around his wrist. Her skin was freezing. "Put it away," she murmured, her dark eyes entirely sincere. "No contracts, no favors, just eat." He slowly withdrew his hand. When the steaming bowls were set between them, he stared at the murky broth. He couldn't remember the last time he had shared a meal that wasn't a negotiation, a veiled threat, or a prelude to violence. He was used to eating in cavernous, empty dining rooms, hyper-aware of every shadow. Here, under the harsh, flickering fluorescent bulb, there was just a girl fighting a desperate war for her grandmother and the apex predator of the city. Yet, as she broke apart her cheap wooden chopsticks, the air between them felt miraculously unarmed. "Why are you standing in the dark for me?" she asked quietly, the steam from the bowl warming her tired face. Dae-pyo traced the rim of the cheap melamine bowl. The armor he wore every day, the ruthless, untouchable persona of the king, suddenly felt suffocating. "I have a fortune that cannot be spent. I have 1,000 men who will kill on my command. The entire city bends the moment I enter a room." He paused, looking up from the table, his obsidian eyes locked onto hers, entirely stripped of their usual ice. "But I have never been more alone, until I stood in your line." Naevia stopped eating. The guarded, unyielding wall she wore to survive finally cracked. She looked at him, truly looked at the scarred, weary man buried beneath the myth, and for the first time, she didn't ask him to step back. It happened in the brief, unforgiving window between the end of her hospital visit and the start of her evening shift. The alleyway near her apartment was empty, devoid of the familiar, broad-shouldered shadow that had anchored her world for the past 3 nights. Dae-pyo had a syndicate to run. Even kings could not stop the rotation of the earth. Min-jae's men knew exactly when to strike. There was no hesitation, no cheap thug banter, just the screech of tires on damp asphalt and the sliding door of an unmarked van violently ripping open. 5 men poured out, wearing the silver lapel pins of the Yoon Syndicate. Naevia fought with the same desperate, clawing ferocity she used to keep her grandmother alive. She shattered her heavy metal flashlight across the first enforcer's jaw, the sickening crunch of bone echoing off the brick walls. But they were trained killers, and there were too many. A heavy fist caught her temple, dropping her to her knees. Before she could scream, a chemical-soaked rag was clamped hard over her mouth, dragging her down into suffocating darkness. Across the city, high above the glittering grid of Gangnam, the temperature in the penthouse boardroom seemed to drop 10 degrees the moment Min-soo burst through the heavy mahogany doors. He didn't observe the customary bow. His face was entirely devoid of color as he approached the long glass table, clutching a sealed plastic evidence bag. Inside was a shattered clipboard and a torn, blood-soaked silver name tag, Naevia's name tag. Dae-pyo's hands stopped moving. He stared at the crimson smear on the plastic. A burner phone inside the bag began to vibrate. Min-soo placed it on the table with a trembling hand and stepped back. Dae-pyo answered it, leaving it on the glass surface. "The king has a weakness after all," Min-jae's voice crackled through the quiet room, thick with arrogant triumph. "The girl for the southern docks, Dae-pyo. Transfer the shipping deeds by midnight or we start sending her back in pieces. Don't test me." The line went dead. Dae-pyo didn't shout. He didn't hurl the phone across the room or shatter the glass table in a fit of rage. The silence that suffocated the penthouse was absolute, heavier and infinitely colder than the winter night outside. He slowly picked up the bloodied name tag, his thumb brushing over the cracked plastic. The fragile, quiet humanity he had just begun to rediscover in a street tent evaporated instantly. The man who had shared warm broth with the tired girl was gone. In his place sat the undisputed monster who had built an empire on bones. Dae-pyo stood up, his obsidian eyes completely dead, the faint scar on his cheek stark white against his tightening jaw. "Cancel the transfers," Dae-pyo murmured, his voice a hollow, terrifying rasp that made his vanguard physically recoil. "And arm every man we have." The underworld of Seoul had forgotten what it looked like when the king went to war. They remembered him as a businessman, a calculating phantom who dealt in contracts and leverage from a glass penthouse in Gangnam. That illusion shattered before midnight. It started at the Yoon Syndicate's underground casinos in Itaewon. The doors didn't just open, they were blown off their hinges. Min-soo led the vanguard, but it was Dae-pyo who walked through the smoke, a terrifying vision of absolute ruin. He didn't carry a weapon. He didn't need to. His men moved like a highly trained scythe, neutralizing any enforcer foolish enough to draw a gun, while the patrons fled in screaming droves. Dae-pyo walked straight to the floor manager, a man desperately trying to scramble over a mahogany roulette table. Min-soo dragged him down, forcing him to his knees amidst scattered chips and shattered glass. "Where is Min-jae holding her?" Dae-pyo asked. His voice was no louder than a whisper, yet it cut perfectly through the groans of bleeding men. The manager spat a curse, his eyes wide with defiant terror. Dae-pyo didn't blink. He simply nodded at Min-soo. A heavy baton came down on the manager's kneecap. The scream tore through the casino, raw and agonizing. "Where?" Dae-pyo repeated, his expression entirely hollow. When the casino yielded nothing but frantic denials, Dae-pyo ordered it burned. They moved to the Yoon shipping warehouses by the Han River, then the illegal loan fronts in Dongdaemun. For 3 hours, Dae-pyo systematically dismantled a decade of his rival's infrastructure, reducing multi-million won operations to ash and splintered wood. He was a localized hurricane of violence, erasing everything Min-jae had ever built. Word spread rapidly. The city's criminal element went to ground, terrified that even looking out their windows would draw the king's eye. The Yoon syndicate was collapsing under the sheer, unbridled ferocity of a man who had suddenly lost the one thing he didn't know he needed. It was at the fourth location, a heavily fortified nightclub in the Eastern District, that the dam finally broke. A high-ranking Yoon lieutenant, bleeding from a shattered jaw and surrounded by the unconscious bodies of his men, finally cracked under the dead obsidian stare of Dae-pyo. "The old shipyard," the lieutenant choked out, coughing up blood onto the neon-lit floor. Dae-pyo didn't offer a sadistic smile or a gloating parting word. He simply turned his back, the heavy wool of his overcoat swirling in the smoky air. "Burn this place too," he commanded over his shoulder. He stepped out into the freezing night, the violent orange glow of the flames reflecting off the faint scar on his cheek. The destruction meant nothing. The millions he had just incinerated meant nothing. There was only the shipyard and the desperate, suffocating need to see if the only woman who had ever told him to wait was still breathing. The silence of the private convalescent suite was heavy, sterile, and entirely foreign. Naevia stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, the plush, high-thread-count robe pooling around her ankles, a stark contrast to the threadbare coat she had worn for years. It had been 4 days since the shipyard, 4 days since the heavy steel doors had been torn open, revealing Dae-pyo amidst a terrifying canvas of violence, his chest vibrating with a silent, earth-shattering relief as he pulled her from the concrete. She reached up, her fingers lightly brushing the fading purple bruise along her jawline. In the dark reflection of the glass, she searched for the exhausted, desperate girl who used to count crumpled bills under the flickering light of a street lamp. She wasn't there anymore. The crushing medical debt that had dictated her every waking breath had vanished. The bottom-feeding loan sharks who had terrorized her doorstep were gone, erased from the city's ecosystem so thoroughly it was as if they had never existed. The grinding, desperate war she had fought every single day had been won, not by her own bleeding hands, but by the devastating wrath of a man who had burned down half the underworld to find her. Earlier that morning, Min-soo had brought her breakfast. The fearsome vanguard had not just bowed, he had lowered his eyes with a profound, unbroken reverence. It wasn't the manufactured terror the city offered Dae-pyo, it was genuine awe. The entire syndicate now knew her face. They knew she was the one who had shattered the ice around their king. Naevia leaned her forehead against the cool glass, looking down at the glittering sprawl of Seoul. She tried to picture going back to the damp alleyway, holding her clipboard, shouting at entitled executives to get to the back of the line. The image dissolved into ash. The streets would never look at her the same way again. The anonymity she had used as a shield was gone, burned away by the fires Dae-pyo had set in her name. She wasn't a captive in this gilded tower. The heavy mahogany doors were unlocked. Dae-pyo had made that agonizingly clear when he sat vigil by her bed, his obsidian eyes stripped of all their armor, swearing he would never cage her. She could walk out into the city right now, and his men would simply part like the sea to let her pass. But as she watched the morning sun slowly bleed over the horizon, chasing away the shadows of Gangnam, Naevia realized she didn't want to run back to the cold. The king had destroyed an empire to prove she was worth protecting. Now it was time to see what she could build from the ruins. The scent of simmering anchovy broth and roasted garlic filled the pristine, stainless steel kitchen, a triumphant elevation of the humble recipes that had kept Naevia alive. The restaurant was hers. No silent partners, no hidden contracts. She had accepted Dae-pyo's protection, but the capital to build this place came from the grueling hours she had already bled into the city, leveraged and multiplied by her own sheer will. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the upscale district of Gangnam bustled, completely oblivious to the fact that the perimeter was currently held by the most lethal vanguard in the country. Min-soo and his men were invisible, blending into the evening crowd, ensuring that nothing would touch this night. Inside, the dining room was quiet, waiting for the first wave of guests. Naevia stood behind the polished hostess stand, taking a deep, shuddering breath. Her hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as she reached back to secure the knot of her heavy canvas apron. The adrenaline of the past month was finally catching up to her. A quiet chime announced the opening of the private side door. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. The air in the room shifted, settling into a heavy, comforting gravity. Dae-pyo stepped into the warm light of the restaurant. He wore a masterfully tailored charcoal suit, his presence as commanding as ever, but the icy, untouchable aura of the king was entirely absent. His obsidian eyes found hers instantly, softening into a look that he reserved only for her. He crossed the gleaming hardwood floor, stopping just inches away. He watched her struggle with the stiff canvas ties of the apron for a moment, his head tilting slightly. "You are shaking," he murmured, his low voice wrapping around her like a shield. "It's just nerves," she breathed out, dropping her arms with a frustrated sigh. "I've faced down debt collectors and syndicates, but apparently opening night is what finally breaks me." A faint, genuine smile broke the stoic lines of Dae-pyo's face, tracing the edge of his scar. He didn't offer empty reassurances or tell her he could handle it for her. Instead, he stepped closer. Slowly, deliberately, the undisputed ruler of Seoul's underworld lowered himself to the floor, the crisp fabric of his trousers pulled taut as he dropped to one knee. A man who had made thousands bow before him, willingly kneeling at her feet. He reached up, his large, scarred hands gently catching the trailing strings of her apron. Naevia's breath hitched. She looked down at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. He wasn't kneeling to beg for her affection, nor was he yielding his power. He was simply showing her with absolute certainty that in this room, she was the one who ruled. With deft, careful movements, he pulled the strings taut and tied a perfect, secure knot at the small of her back. Dae-pyo looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers, steady and infinite. "Open the doors, Naevia," he said softly, rising to his feet and taking his place at her side. "Let them see the queen." From standing in the freezing cold behind a velvet rope to kneeling in the warmth of her kingdom, the undisputed king of Seoul finally met his match. But in a world where power is everything, keeping that peace is an entirely different war. If you loved watching Naevia make the king wait in line and want to see more high-stakes stories of power, loyalty, and redemption, make sure to smash that like button and hit subscribe right now. We are building this empire with viewers all over the globe, so drop into the comments and tell us, where in the world are you watching from today? The saga is far from over, so keep your eyes peeled for the next upload.